Today we're going to take a slightly different turn in the discussion around leadership to looking at self-leadership as a topic area and emotional intelligence. Today's guest is a psychologist, leadership and wellbeing coach, trainer and facilitator, as well as mental toughness partner. She is the founder of Bakjac Consulting. Can I welcome to the podcast Michelle Bakjac? How are you, Michelle?
Very well, thanks, Eric. How are you going today?
Mate, I'm fantastic. Appreciate your time helping out with this discussion around leadership. Self-leadership, can you give me a definition that we can share out and then what it might mean in that world of work and for leaders in particular?
I think if you want a really simple definition, self-leadership is the practice of intentionally influencing your own thinking, feeling, actions towards your objectives. We so much, when we're in a leadership role, focus on external factors. We consider processes, outcomes, performance, communication, other people, and we often forget about the fact that if we are not self-leading, it's very hard to lead others. So we've got to think about shaping and influencing those internal factors before we can then turn to those external factors.
One of the issues that is constantly brought up in the discussion, at least in the work that I'm doing to produce the podcast around leadership, is this thing of identifying your own headspace before getting in and doing that task of leadership and knowing yourself to a greater degree than might otherwise be the case if you weren't in a leadership position. Have you found in your travels as a psychologist and in those other roles that I nominated before that you work in, that we're not very good as human beings at doing that?
No, absolutely not. I think, we tend to turn ourselves to, everything else that's going on around us. And as a psychologist, we talk about having an internal or an external locus of control. We focus on everything that's going on around us and trying to fix that or work through it, but we don't focus on what's going on inside us and our internal power to manage that in a productive way. So I think, Lao Tzu has a famous expression. He says, mastering others is strength, mastering yourself is true power. So how do we, more focus on that internal aspect for self? I think that's really where we can start. And once we've gained that power, we've then got the opportunity to master the strength we've got external to us.
We're looking at this idea of managing the self or self-leadership. That to what extent does this idea about empathy for others, and particularly those that are led, come into play? Because and why I asked this, and don't know if the link is a tenuous one or if it's there and I just haven't seen it before, that when you're thinking about how you're going to be a better professional and a better human being when you're dealing with people in this world of work, that people have very different motivations for being at work, but they have some common underlying reasons to be there that, like I said, that are there for everybody. So people want to be acknowledged for the work they do, and people want to do work that has some purpose in mind. Does that ring true when you're trying to get the best out of being yourself?
You use that word empathy, and if you think about what the word empathy actually means, probably the one word that resonates the most is the word understanding. So we have to be able to understand what makes ourselves tick. Do we have self-awareness? Do we have understanding of our own intent, our own values, the traits, the set of beliefs that make us move forward? And if we are aware of those, then what it does is it gives ourselves an opportunity to have a better radar, so to speak, for what's also driving other people, gaining an understanding of what their drivers and values and intent and purpose is. And when we sort of gain that level of understanding about self and about others, it gives ourselves greater opportunity to self-lead, but then greater opportunity to lead others as well. So empathy is a big part of both self-leadership and leadership as a whole.
Being able to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, I think, is critical to being a more effective leader. Now, not everyone understands that as a need in leadership positions, and why I say that is you'll always run into somebody who is not a good leader, but you can learn from them. And I learned very early on in my career that you need to value those that are around you and let them know that you do. So when you're training, and again, I don't want to reveal obviously things that are your IP here when you're training groups, but in general, how do you get someone to be more self-reflective without them immediately putting barriers up? And why I ask that question is being self-reflective and the definition that you talked about before is a potential threat to how we see ourselves. So how do you get over that hump? And I may be talking nonsense, but it just comes to my head that some people won't want to have that conversation because some people don't want to test those waters.
There's a whole lot that you can answer with respect to that. So I think one of the first things I talk to people about in gaining that understanding is Timothy Galway actually came up with a bit of an equation in his In a Game series of books. And it's a really simple equation. It's that performance equals your potential minus your interference. So if you think about that, what are the things that are potentially getting in your way at the moment? Because if we removed all of our interference, the only thing that would equal our performance is our potential. So how do you recognise what's in the box, so to speak, of what might be getting in your way? I think what I tend to look at people like when we're talking about this empathy piece, when we're talking about understanding that people are different from you, is I use old Paracio's principle. If you've heard Paracio's principle before, it's the 80-20 rule. So many times in life, you might say, for example, for a teacher might spend 80% of her time with 20% of her students. Or the opposite way around, you might see that in any society, 20% of the population commit 80% of the crime. So I think we can also apply this with respect to our leadership. So if you understand who your true, authentic self is, right, and you really understand what your drivers are, what your values are, and you want to live true to who you are, you want to live that 80% of the time. However, what you have to do is that you have to flex that last 20% of yourself to consider who it is you're speaking with. So what are their drivers? What makes them tick? How do they see the world? What's their purpose? Why are they at this workplace? And if you've got that opportunity to flex that last 20% of yourself and really have empathy as to who it is you're speaking to, how they typically communicate, what their method of communication is, you've got a much better opportunity to hit the mark but still live true to your authentic style. So if you don't do that and you only communicate and be yourself, then I think you miss so much of an opportunity to miss that connection that you've got with other people. That was a bit of a long, convoluted response to that. I hope that answers the question.
That made a lot of sense to me. It just for your information, authentic leadership has been brought up a lot as a topic area, and so I would assume that this concept of self-management, self-leadership is an element of being an authentic leader.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think you have to, if you are going, if you think about what that word authentic means, you're really trying to believe and understand who you really are. And I think that's one of the issues today in leadership is that people don't actually have a clear understanding. They don't start with that self-leadership and actually almost come up with the clarity of definition as to what they want their leadership to represent, who they actually going to be as a leader. Are they going to be somebody who's forthright? Are they going to be somebody who puts empathy first? Are they going to be somebody who's quite tough but fair? If they had to almost put 2 or 3 words around their leadership, could they come up with that really easily? Because let me tell you, if you can't define your own leadership, it's pretty hard for the people you're leading to understand that. So I think that's one of the most effective things that you can do as a self-leader is to really have that authenticity around and clarity of understanding about what you want your leadership to represent.
So can you define for us what emotional intelligence is?
Sure. I really love one of the simple things to kind of recognise, and Dan Goleman, who's one of the founders of emotional intelligence, he talked about the fact that IQ gets you hired and EQ gets you fired. And I think a lot of the time we put a lot of investment these days into people's skills. And, that's the first thing that most people see when they look at applying for a job, is that they send off their CV or their resume, which is all of the information about that individual on paper and what skills that they've actually been undertaking. However, what they don't really get to write down on paper is what their actual ability is to manage their emotional responses and have the opportunity to manage an environment in which they find themselves. So how do they manage their emotions, have self-awareness, emotional management, and also interact and have emotional awareness with others? I think we probably still put far too much emphasis on people's skills in terms of hard skills. So if we talk about the difference between hard and soft skills, a lot of people come in and say, for example, oh, this person has never worked in this industry before. For example, I recently was providing leadership coaching for a CEO of a very large organisation, and they were a nursing home. And so he was leading people in the nursing industry, and he'd actually come from an industry that had no correlation to that whatsoever, but was appointed to the CEO. And one of the things that got levelled at him initially was, well, he has no understanding of our business. But interestingly, he might not have had a registered nursing degree in his background, but what he did have was those leadership skills, the ability to identify what other people's needs were, to communicate really clearly, to understand people's intent and purpose. And so, interestingly, after only 6 months, after being given that first level of criticism, what he got was resounding accolades from all of his staff, because they felt like for the first time they'd been heard, their concerns were understood, there was actual leadership and drive for vision moving forward. Every single staff member in the organisation felt that they had a clear vision, and yet only 6 months before they'd all been saying, this man knows nothing about our industry. So I think we've got to separate out that sort of IQ and our opportunity to really drive leadership and think about those soft skills.
What do you believe from your interactions with leaders and your own leadership journey are what you might call the key leadership capabilities? So if I asked you, and I'll ask you outright here, if you had to rank a group of core leader capabilities that you think are essential for individuals.
Oh, geez, how long have you got? Okay. All right, so I think having a clear intent is probably exceptionally important. Have you got a clear purpose or an understanding of your why? Often that's going to, I think, precede any purposeful action that you've got. It's going to come before the what and the how. So, do you have that clear intent, that clear purpose? I think self-awareness is a big part. Do you understand your intent, your values, your traits? Otherwise, if you don't really have a clear understanding of self, it's just going to interfere with your performance. And in line with that is a clear element of self-acceptance. And that's about being honest with yourself and accepting yourself without self-criticism or self-sabotage. Is a default position. We focus on our negatives about ourselves, and our brain's kind of hardwired to that. But what do we know about ourselves, and how do we accept ourselves? And then how do we go on for self-management? Once we're aware of what makes us tick, do we then manage what makes us tick? I think also one of the areas of work that I do a lot with leaders is in around their mental toughness. And this is seen as a reservoir of personal resources that enables an individual to produce consistently high levels of performance or goal attainment despite the everyday challenges and adversities they're faced with. And I think there's a big element then of self-confidence and self-efficacy, as well as this continuous focus on self-growth and having a growth mindset. So, my husband often accuses me of having the ability to talk underwater. When it gets onto some of these things, I think, we've really got an opportunity to dig deeper into some of these elements and focus on them individually.
Based on everything you've just said there, some of the best leaders I think I've been drawn to that I've learnt something from draw on those things that you're talking about, not necessarily consciously. It's just part of how they are as people. So they worry about or take into consideration the feelings of others. They think that work should have a value and a meaning to people. They know that they need to communicate what their own values are, and that there's an end point to why you're at work, and that they understand that a good chunk of our lives is spent with these people in that world of work. So trying to make it as a interesting and stress-free environment as you humanly can is an important thing to be able to do.
I think, you hear this old expression, they're a born leader. And when you look at, those individuals who we typically label in that way, that they're a born leader, they may not necessarily have done any study. They might not have done an MBA. They might not have done, a 6-year PhD. They may not have done any of that typical paper and pencil work that we so much hang our hats on with respect to what a good leader should be. But they've just got this inherent style about them that everybody looks towards them. And I think, we do just focus too much on those, that hard skill of that piece of paper rather than the soft skill of what is it about this individual which will make others want to follow them. And I think we've just got to, kind of recognise that as our real opportunity to how do we cultivate those soft skills. And those leaders who are, born naturals at it, we can look at what they do well and then look at cultivating our own skills in that respect. Simple things like, my mum always used to say to me, we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that's the proportion in which we should use them. So thinking that a leader often perceives that they should do most of the talking, whereas in fact a leader should be doing most of the listening. And when you connect that back to something we were talking about earlier with empathy, empathy is about understanding. So how can we understand if we're talking all the time? We've got to listen a lot more. So again, such a soft skill that needs to be developed, but people follow people who they perceive have heard them. So what is it about you as an individual that assists people to follow you? I think that's one of the biggest criteria we can look at when it comes to our self-leadership.
I'd like to ask you one more question, and this one is around your own leadership experience and what you've seen in the leadership of others. If you had to say in the growth of your leadership or your leadership journey, what are the things that people need to be doing in your estimation to make sure that they're staying relevant as a good leader from that perspective of self-leadership and self-management?
Geez, asking me to do just one, that's a bit tough, Eric. Look, I think, if you look at it, it's never stop learning. Really getting into that growth mindset of what you really want to consider and knowing that, I think that the understanding, you're never, ever going to be an expert. You never reach the end of the leadership journey in now focusing on, well, now I'm the perfect leader. That's never going to happen. You'll always have the opportunity to learn something new, evolve, change, pivot, be agile in terms of what you do. And if you recognize that there is the need for this constant agility, the need for this constant growth, to accept information as feedback and not as criticism, that whenever somebody gives you insight or information about your leadership, that your ears should be flapping to hear the valuable information that is, because all that it does is give you more insight for your own personal growth. So I think if I'd like to say anything is that leadership is a constant growth experience. And if you're open to that, then that is one of your biggest learning opportunities.
Look, Michelle, again, thank you for your time. And for those listening, this has been Talking Leadership, and I'll catch you all on the next podcast.